You're telling me a $40 million fighter jet just decided not to wake up today? The voice cut sharply through the shimmering afternoon heat of Falcon Ridge Air Base, where the Texas sun baked the concrete tarmac until the air itself seemed to ripple. The F-16 sat motionless in the center of the flight line, its sleek gray body gleaming under the bright sky, its canopy sealed, its nose pointed toward an empty stretch of runway, as if it were waiting for permission to breathe again. Around it stood a cluster of technicians in crisp flight line coveralls, their laptops balanced on tool carts, diagnostic cables running from polished equipment into the silent aircraft. Green text flickered across their screens. Every system reported normal. Fuel pressure normal. Avionics normal. Ignition sequence ready. Yet the jet refused to start. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the aircraft like it had personally offended him. "Run the startup again," he said, though his voice carried the edge of someone who already knew the result. Kyle Mercer, the lead technician, wiped grease from his palms onto a rag and jabbed at the keyboard. A moment later the ground power unit hummed. Lights blinked along the F-16's fuselage, and for 3 hopeful seconds the air filled with the whine of spinning electronics. Then the sound died. The jet went silent again, as stubborn as a locked vault. Mercer exhaled through his nose and kicked lightly at the front landing gear. "That's the 3rd time," he muttered. "Diagnostics say she's perfect, but she won't even cough." The flight line was supposed to be buzzing with excitement today. In less than 2 hours, a visiting general and a row of civilian defense contractors would be seated under the shaded viewing stand across the runway, waiting to watch this exact aircraft demonstrate a precision takeoff. Instead, the most advanced fighter jet on the base was sitting there like a very expensive lawn ornament. A small group of airmen had gathered near the edge of the ramp, watching the technicians circle the aircraft with growing frustration. Beyond them, separated by a waist-high security fence, an old man stood quietly with his hands resting on the metal rail. He wore faded denim jeans, a worn olive jacket, and a pair of boots that had clearly walked more miles than the polished footwear on the flight line. His white hair stirred slightly in the warm breeze drifting across the concrete. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't staring at the computers or the technicians. His pale blue eyes were fixed on the aircraft itself, moving slowly along the fuselage, across the intake, up toward the base of the vertical stabilizer. Kyle Mercer noticed him after a moment and frowned. "Hey," he called out, stepping toward the fence. "Flight lines restricted, sir." The old man didn't move right away. He tilted his head slightly, listening to the distant hum of generators and the faint metallic ticking coming from the jet as the sun warmed its skin. Then he looked up. "That bird's been sitting like that for long?" he asked calmly. Mercer let out a short laugh, glancing back at Brooks. "Long enough to know it's not something you fix with guesswork." A few of the younger technicians chuckled. The old man nodded slowly, still studying the aircraft like someone listening to a conversation no one else could hear. "Engines aren't the problem," he said quietly. Mercer raised an eyebrow. "Oh really?" he replied, folding his arms. "And what exactly do you think you're looking at, Grandpa?" Mercer let the question hang in the heat for a moment, the kind of silence that invited laughter, and the younger technicians did not disappoint. A few snorted quietly while another leaned against a tool cart and folded his arms, enjoying the moment. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks walked over from the other side of the aircraft, squinting slightly against the glare of the sun reflecting off the canopy. The smell of warm concrete and jet fuel hung faintly in the air, carried on a lazy breeze moving across the flight line. Brooks stopped beside Mercer and glanced past him toward the fence where the old man stood. For a few seconds he said nothing, studying the stranger with the casual suspicion of someone responsible for keeping a tightly controlled area secure. Then he spoke in a flat, professional tone. "Sir, this section of the base is restricted to active personnel and authorized contractors." The old man nodded once as if he had expected that response. "I understand that," he said calmly. Mercer tilted his head and looked back at the aircraft with exaggerated patience. "Well, that is good to hear, because this aircraft has a team of certified technicians, advanced diagnostic systems, and direct support from the manufacturer. If there was a problem that needed solving, we would already know where it is." The old man's eyes drifted slowly across the F-16 again, from the intake to the landing gear, then along the underside of the fuselage where the sunlight revealed faint ripples of heat rising from the metal skin. He listened for a moment, the way someone might listen to an engine long after it had stopped running. Brooks followed his gaze and frowned slightly. "We have run every startup sequence twice," he said. "Fuel pressure is normal. Electrical systems are normal. Ignition system is normal. The computer reports no fault anywhere in the aircraft." Mercer lifted his tablet and waved it lightly for emphasis. "Every indicator on this screen is green, which means the aircraft should be running right now." The old man rested both hands on the fence rail and nodded again, thoughtful rather than impressed. "Computers are good at telling you what they see," he said quietly. Mercer smirked and shook his head. "That is kind of the point of them." Brooks watched the old man more closely now. Something about the calm certainty in his voice did not match the easy confidence of someone guessing. "What exactly do you think is wrong then?" Brooks asked. The old man did not answer right away. Instead, he stepped a little closer to the fence and tilted his head again toward the silent aircraft. The distant hum of ground equipment echoed faintly around the ramp. A maintenance truck rolled somewhere far behind the hangars. Above them, the sky was wide and clear, the kind of bright blue that pilots loved and mechanics feared when equipment decided to fail at the worst possible time. Finally, the old man spoke again. "The engine is fine," he said. "The problem is that the aircraft does not know it is allowed to start." Mercer blinked once, then laughed out loud. "Allowed to start? That is a new one." Brooks crossed his arms slowly. "Explain that," he said. The old man pointed toward the aircraft without raising his voice. "Somewhere between the ignition system and the control relay, there is a signal that never finishes its job. Everything looks normal because the system believes the command was completed, but the aircraft is still waiting for permission it never received." Mercer stared at him for a second, then glanced down at his tablet again as if the answer might suddenly appear there. "That is not how the startup sequence works," he said. Brooks did not laugh this time. Instead, he looked back at the old man and asked a quieter question. "How would you know that?" The old man finally looked away from the aircraft and met his eyes. "Because I have heard that silence before," he said. For several seconds, no one on the flight line spoke. The hot wind moved slowly across the concrete, rattling a loose tag hanging from a tool cart, while the silent aircraft stood between them like a stubborn monument. Kyle Mercer stared at the old man through the fence, trying to decide whether he was listening to confidence or nonsense. Finally, he shook his head and laughed again, though the sound carried a faint edge now. "That is a very interesting theory," he said, "but this aircraft runs on digital control systems and automated ignition protocols. It does not wait for permission from ghosts." A couple of technicians chuckled quietly behind him. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks did not laugh. His eyes moved from the old man back to the aircraft, and then to the tablet still glowing in Mercer's hands. The diagnostics remained unchanged, perfect green across every system. Yet the aircraft still refused to start. Brooks rubbed his chin slowly. "You said you have heard that silence before," he said. "Where exactly would someone hear something like that?" The old man rested his forearms on the fence rail and looked back toward the aircraft again instead of answering directly. The sun had climbed higher now, and the metal skin of the jet reflected light in sharp white flashes. Heat shimmered above the runway in slow waves that blurred the horizon beyond the base. After a moment, the old man spoke in the same steady tone. "Aircraft talk if you listen long enough," he said. "Not with words. With patterns." Mercer lifted both eyebrows and gestured toward the aircraft dramatically. "It is a jet fighter, sir. Not a campfire story." Brooks stepped a little closer to the fence. Something in the old man's posture was beginning to bother him. The stranger did not look like someone trying to impress anyone. He looked like someone who had already decided what he believed. "How long have you been standing there watching?" Brooks asked. "Long enough to know the problem did not begin today," the old man replied. Mercer frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" The old man pointed toward the underside of the aircraft again, not dramatically, just a small motion with one finger. "Startup systems fail slowly sometimes," he said. "A relay begins to hesitate. A control line sends a signal that arrives a fraction of a second too late. Computers call that normal until the delay grows long enough to matter." Brooks glanced toward the aircraft intake where sunlight glowed faintly inside the curved metal. The idea sounded unlikely, but the calm certainty in the old man's voice made it difficult to dismiss completely. Mercer turned his tablet around and tapped the screen again. Every relay check passed. Every control response passed. The aircraft should be ready to start right now. The old man nodded again. That is what the system believes. Brooks studied him for another long second. Then he asked the question that had been building quietly in the back of his mind. Who are you exactly? The old man shifted his weight slightly and reached into the inside pocket of his faded olive jacket. The technicians immediately watched more carefully, expecting paperwork or perhaps a visitor badge. Instead, he pulled out a small leather pouch worn smooth by years of handling. The snap on the flap was polished bright where a thumb had opened it countless times. Mercer squinted at it and smirked again. Let me guess, he said. A lucky wrench from the 1970s. The old man held the pouch in his hand for a moment and looked at the aircraft again before answering. Something like that, he said quietly. Then he looked back at Brooks. The general asked me to stop by and see why his aircraft will not start. Brooks blinked once. Mercer lowered the tablet slowly. The wind carried the distant sound of another jet taking off somewhere beyond the far end of the runway. And for the first time since the problem began that morning, the technicians on the flight line stopped smiling. The flight line grew noticeably quieter after those words. Kyle Mercer lowered his tablet completely now, staring at the worn leather pouch in the old man's hand, as if it might suddenly explain everything. For a moment, the only sound was the soft metallic ticking coming from the sun-warmed skin of the aircraft and the distant rumble of ground equipment somewhere beyond the hangars. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks narrowed his eyes slightly. The general asked you to come here, he repeated slowly, weighing each word. The old man nodded once, calm and unhurried. That is correct. Mercer let out a short breath that was half disbelief and half irritation. With respect, sir, the general does not normally solve maintenance issues by inviting people from outside the engineering division. The old man's expression did not change. He simply opened the small leather pouch and looked inside it for a second, as if confirming something was still there. Then he closed it again with a quiet snap. Brooks watched the motion carefully. What exactly did the general tell you? He asked. The old man lifted his eyes back toward the silent aircraft standing 20 yards away on the sun-baked concrete. He said the jet would not start, he replied. Brooks glanced toward Mercer, who shook his head immediately. That message could have come from any number of channels, Mercer said. Maintenance requests move through 5 departments before anything like that reaches a general officer. The old man gave a small, thoughtful shrug. Maybe he remembers how these things used to work. Mercer chuckled again, but the sound was thinner this time. I doubt a 4-star general is calling retired mechanics to troubleshoot modern fighter aircraft. Motionless under the bright sky, its intake dark and silent, its landing gear planted firmly on the concrete as if it had decided to become part of the ground itself. The green diagnostic screens beside Mercer continued to glow with quiet confidence. Every system normal. Every signal complete. Brooks turned back to the old man. What is your name? He asked. The man hesitated only briefly before answering. Robert Harlan. Mercer repeated the name under his breath as if testing it for importance. It meant nothing to him. Brooks felt the same empty recognition. All right, Mr. Harlan, he said, I will verify that authorization. In the meantime, you will need to remain behind the fence. The old man nodded and returned his gaze to the aircraft again, studying the metal surfaces with that same quiet focus. Mercer followed his line of sight and shook his head. Even if he walked out here, he muttered quietly to Brooks, what exactly would he fix that 20 certified technicians and 3 diagnostic systems cannot even identify? Brooks did not answer right away. He was still watching the old man. And for reasons he could not explain yet, the calm look in Robert Harlan's eyes made the silent aircraft on the runway seem slightly less mysterious than it had 10 minutes earlier. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks stepped a few yards away from the fence and pulled a small radio from his belt, lowering his voice as he contacted the base operations desk. Kyle Mercer watched him go, then glanced back toward Robert Harlan with a skeptical tilt of his head. The older man had not moved. He still stood with both hands resting lightly on the metal rail, his attention fixed on the aircraft as though the conversation around him had already faded into the background. The sunlight reflected along the smooth, gray fuselage, and faint waves of heat shimmered above the concrete runway. Mercer followed Harlan's gaze again and shook his head slowly. I still do not understand what you think you are seeing, he said. That aircraft has more sensors in its startup sequence than most people have tools in their garage. returned from his call. The lieutenant's expression had changed slightly. Not dramatically, but enough that Mercer noticed it immediately. "Well?" Mercer asked. "Did headquarters confirm the mystery mechanic?" Brooks hesitated for half a second before answering. "They confirmed that someone named Robert Harlan has base access clearance today." Mercer blinked. That was unexpected, but still far from convincing. "That does not explain why a retired civilian would be standing here diagnosing aircraft problems from behind a fence," he said. Brooks nodded once, still watching the older man carefully. "No, it does not." Mercer leaned one elbow on the tool cart and studied Harlan again. The man's olive jacket had faded patches along the shoulders, and the cuffs were worn smooth from years of use. It was the kind of jacket people kept long after it had gone out of style. And yet the calm way he watched the aircraft did not resemble curiosity. It looked more like recognition. Brooks stepped closer to the fence again. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "operations confirmed that you were cleared to enter the base this morning." Harlan turned his head slightly and met the lieutenant's eyes. "That is good," he said. Mercer spread his hands in disbelief. "You are seriously considering letting him near the aircraft?" Brooks did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted briefly back toward the jet sitting quietly on the sunlit ramp. The diagnostic screens beside Mercer still glowed green with stubborn certainty. Everything normal. Everything ready. Everything silent. Brooks exhaled slowly and returned his attention to Harlan, stared at him for a moment, then shook his head. "That would require a timing delay smaller than 1/10 of a second." Harlan nodded slightly. "Exactly." Brooks looked back at the aircraft again, and for the first time that afternoon, the perfect green screens beside the tool cart suddenly felt less convincing than they had a few minutes earlier. For several seconds no one spoke. The hot wind moved slowly across the runway, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and sun-warmed metal. Kyle Mercer stared at Robert Harlan through the fence as if he had just heard someone calmly suggest that gravity might be optional. "A timing delay smaller than 1/10 of a second," Mercer repeated quietly. Then he shook his head and let out a short laugh that did not sound nearly as confident as the ones before. "That would never pass through the diagnostic system without being flagged. Every relay cycle is monitored. Every signal confirmation is logged." Harlan nodded slightly as though he had expected that answer. "The system monitors the relay," he said, "but it does not always monitor the mount that holds the relay." Mercer frowned. "That does not make any sense." Brooks raised a hand slightly, stopping him from continuing. "Answer immediately." His eyes remained fixed on the aircraft as though he were looking at a memory instead of a machine. For a moment the flight line seemed to fade into a quiet hum of distant engines and wind. Then he spoke. "Because I have seen that delay before," he said softly. "Not in a computer report. In the sound an aircraft makes when it almost starts." Mercer tilted his head slightly. "The jet has not made any sound at all today." Harlan finally looked at him again. "That is because the system believes the command completed," he said. "The aircraft is still waiting for confirmation that never comes." Brooks exhaled slowly and looked back toward the silent fighter again. His eyes drifted again toward the narrow access section beneath the intake where Harlan had pointed earlier. It was a small panel, hardly noticeable against the smooth gray body of the aircraft, the kind of component technicians passed 100 times without thinking about it. Still, the idea had lodged in his mind. A relay mount shifting by a fraction of a millimeter. A signal that started correctly but never truly finished. Brooks looked back toward Harlan, standing calmly behind the fence. "If what you are saying is correct," he said carefully, "the entire aircraft could be waiting for a signal delay that the system does not recognize as a fault." Harlan nodded slightly, as though the statement was simply common sense. Mercer rubbed his forehead and muttered under his breath. "That would mean every diagnostic system we ran today is technically correct and still completely useless." Brooks glanced toward him. "Stranger things have happened in complex machines." Mercer did not respond. He was staring at the aircraft again, mentally replaying the startup sequences they had already performed. Each attempt had followed the exact protocol. Each attempt had ended in the same quiet refusal. Brooks turned his attention back to Harlan. "You mentioned the adjustment bolt on the relay bracket," he said. "If someone were to inspect it, what would they expect to find?" Harlan considered the question briefly. "Probably nothing obvious," he replied. "The contact alignment would still look correct. The difference would only appear when the relay cycles under heat expansion." Mercer gave a short laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. In other words, we would not notice it unless someone already knew where to look. Harlan nodded once. Brooks folded his arms and stared toward the aircraft again. The flight line had grown unusually quiet around them. Even the younger technicians who had been joking earlier now watched the conversation with cautious curiosity. One of them shifted his weight and looked toward Mercer. "Should we open the panel?" he asked quietly. Mercer did not answer immediately. The procedure required authorization, documentation, and time they no longer had. The demonstration flight was already running late, and the visiting command staff would arrive soon. Brooks looked at the aircraft one more time. Then he turned back toward Harlan. "You said the general asked you to stop by?" he said. Harlan nodded. Brooks hesitated for a moment before pulling the radio from his belt again. Mercer looked at him sharply. "You are not seriously about to escalate this based on a guess from someone outside the maintenance chain." Brooks held the radio in his hand and glanced once more toward the silent aircraft. "It has not started all afternoon," he said quietly. Mercer did not argue with that. Brooks pressed the transmit button and spoke calmly into the radio. "Operations, this is Lieutenant Brooks on the Falcon Ridge flight line. I need confirmation on a visitor named Robert Harlan and whether the command office is expecting him near aircraft maintenance today." There was a brief burst of static on the channel. The reply came a few seconds later. Brooks listened without speaking while Mercer watched his expression carefully. When the transmission ended, Brooks lowered the radio slowly. Mercer studied his face. "Well," he asked. Brooks looked toward Robert Harlan again, and for the first time that afternoon his voice carried a hint of something new. "Respect." They said if Robert Harlan is standing on that flight line, he is not a visitor. He is the reason the aircraft is still on the ground. For a moment, the words seemed to settle over the flight line like the quiet before a storm. Kyle Mercer stared at Lieutenant Brooks as if he had misheard the radio transmission. "The reason the aircraft is still on the ground," Mercer repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Brooks did not answer immediately. His eyes had already shifted back toward Robert Harlan, who still stood calmly behind the fence with his hands resting on the metal rail as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The afternoon sun glowed across the aircraft's smooth fuselage, while heat waves rolled upward from the concrete runway. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes earlier. Yet the atmosphere around the flight line had changed completely. Mercer finally exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, that explains why operations sounded like they already knew the name," he muttered. Brooks stepped toward the gate in the fence and unlocked it with a small metallic click. The younger technicians nearby watched the movement with open curiosity now. One of them whispered quietly to another while they both looked toward the older man. Brooks pushed the gate open and stepped aside. "Mr. Harlan," he said calmly, "you are cleared to enter the flight line." Harlan gave a small nod and walked forward with unhurried steps, passing through the gate and onto the wide stretch of sunlit concrete. The wind lifted the edge of his olive jacket as he approached the aircraft. Mercer followed him closely, still holding the diagnostic tablet like a shield of certainty. "I hope you understand how unusual this situation is," Mercer said carefully. "We do not normally allow unscheduled adjustments on an aircraft without a full engineering review." Harlan looked toward the silent jet and nodded once. "That makes sense," he said. Brooks walked beside them as they approached the aircraft. Up close, the fighter towered over the small group, its landing gear casting narrow shadows across the concrete. The narrow access panel beneath the intake sat exactly where Harlan had pointed earlier, secured by a row of small fasteners that most people would never notice. Mercer crouched beside the tool cart and pulled out a compact driver set, handing it to one of the younger technicians. "Open the panel," he said quietly. The technician knelt beside the intake and began loosening the fasteners one by one. Each small metallic click sounded unusually loud in the still afternoon air. Within a minute, the panel swung open, revealing a compact compartment of wiring channels and mounted components. Mercer leaned forward and pointed with the tip of a pen. "That is the ignition control relay housing," he said, glancing back toward Harlan. "Everything appears exactly where it should be." Harlan stepped closer and crouched slowly beside the compartment. He studied the relay mount for several seconds without touching anything. Brooks watched his face carefully. "What do you see?" the lieutenant asked. Harlan reached into the pocket of his jacket and removed the small worn leather pouch. When he opened it, a compact tool with a narrow adjustment head rested inside. Mercer blinked in surprise. That tool looked older than half the equipment on the flight line. Harlan positioned himself beside the relay mount and gently placed the tip of the tool against a small adjustment bolt barely visible along the bracket edge. "There it is," he said softly. Mercer leaned closer. "I do not see anything wrong with it." Harlan smiled faintly. "You would not," he said. Then he turned the bolt slightly, less than a quarter turn, and withdrew the tool again. He stood up slowly and looked toward Brooks. "Try the startup sequence now," he said calmly. Mercer stared at him in disbelief for a moment before turning toward the technician beside the cockpit ladder. "Run ignition sequence again," he called out. The technician acknowledged and moved quickly to the control console. The ground power unit hummed to life again, and a moment later the aircraft's internal systems began their startup cycle. Lights flickered along the fuselage. The faint whine of electronics rose into the warm air. Then something different happened. Instead of fading into silence like before, the sound continued. A deep mechanical growl rolled through the aircraft as the engine spooled upward, the vibration spreading across the concrete runway beneath their feet. The silent aircraft that had refused every command all afternoon finally answered. The sound rolled across the runway like distant thunder that refused to fade. The engine continued to spool, deeper and stronger with every passing second until the entire aircraft seemed to come alive under the bright afternoon sky. Warm air blasted from the exhaust as the turbine reached full idle power, the steady mechanical roar filling the flight line with a vibration that could be felt through the soles of their boots. For a moment no one moved. The technicians who had spent the entire afternoon staring at silent diagnostic screens now stood frozen beside their equipment, watching the fighter jet breathe again as if they had just witnessed something impossible. Kyle Mercer slowly lowered the tablet in his hands, the bright green system indicators suddenly feeling far less impressive than they had an hour earlier. Every signal now reported exactly what it had promised all along. Ready. Active. Operational. Mercer stared at the aircraft and then slowly turned toward Robert Harlan, who stood calmly beside the open access panel as if nothing unusual had happened. The older man had already slipped the small adjustment tool back into the worn leather pouch and closed the flap with a quiet snap. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks looked from the roaring engine to Harlan and shook his head slightly, still processing what he had just seen. All afternoon the aircraft had refused every command, and yet one small adjustment had brought it instantly back to life. Mercer walked closer to the intake compartment and crouched beside the relay housing, examining the bracket carefully. The bolt Harlan had turned looked exactly the same as it had before. There was no visible damage, no obvious misalignment. Nothing dramatic enough to explain why an aircraft worth tens of millions of dollars had been completely silent for hours. Mercer stood slowly and looked back at Harlan. "You adjusted it by less than a quarter turn," he said quietly. Harlan nodded once. "Just enough to finish the signal path." Brooks watched the aircraft continue its steady idle cycle and folded his arms thoughtfully. The startup sequence now flowed exactly the way the computer had predicted earlier in the afternoon. Only this time the engine had followed through with the command it had been waiting for all day. The lieutenant glanced toward the technicians gathered along the flight line. Some of them were still staring at the jet. Others were looking at Harlan as if trying to understand who he really was. Mercer exhaled slowly and shook his head in disbelief. "We ran every diagnostic system available on this base," he said. "None of them even hinted at that problem." Harlan looked toward the aircraft and gave a faint smile. "Machines are honest," he replied quietly. "Sometimes they just speak in ways computers do not hear." The deep, steady rumble of the engine filled the warm air while sunlight reflected across the smooth gray wings. Brooks stepped forward and extended his hand. "Mr. Harlan," he said with genuine respect, "I believe we owe you more than a thank you." Harlan shook his hand politely, but without ceremony. "Just doing what I was asked to do," he replied. Mercer looked at the aircraft again and then back at the older man. "I have spent 15 years working on aircraft systems," he said slowly, "and I have never seen anyone diagnose a problem like that from 30 yards away." Harlan glanced once more at the fighter jet, standing ready on the runway, and rested the leather pouch back into his jacket pocket. "When you listen long enough," he said calmly, "machines eventually tell you the truth." The three men stood quietly for a moment while the aircraft idled with quiet strength under the bright American sky, and the technicians on the flight line watched the older man walk away with the slow, steady steps of someone who had already solved problems far more complicated than a silent engine waiting for permission to start.